On this Sunday night, game over for Novak Djokovic. The unvaccinated tennis star is deported from Australia after losing his bid to stay and play. What it means for the world number one.
Not only does he end up on the losing end of the draw at the Australian Open, but I don't think he does anything for his public image.
Canada's COVID rules. What's behind the growing calls to scrap on-arrival testing at Canadian airports? Plus the search for victims of the deadly explosion in Ottawa.
Many people are working together day and night to make sure that we find your loved ones.
Why the investigation is proving so challenging. And a banner year off BC's coast.
I think the message is that we have a lot to be hopeful for.
A spike in sightings and a baby boom fuel hope for whale populations in the Pacific.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. After days of dramatic back and forths, tonight the Australian Open is getting underway without its defending men's champion. Novak Djokovic has been deported after losing his last-ditch appeal to stay in the country. Eric Sorensen has tonight's top story on the final ruling and reaction to it.
It was the final frenzy for the world's top tennis player. Australia's federal court sealed his fate.
The orders of the court are: 1, the amended application be dismissed.
Novak Djokovic dismissed from the Australian Open and from the country. Without delay, he headed for the airport, issuing a statement: "I am extremely disappointed with the court ruling to dismiss my application."
The court will then adjourn.
Outside court, Djokovic supporters fell silent.
It's a political stunt. This is just so political.
The court's Chief Justice said he was not ruling on the merits of the government decision to revoke Djokovic's visa, only on its legality. The government required visitors without a valid medical exemption to be fully vaccinated. Djokovic was not.
That is the policy. That policy hasn't changed.
On the court ruling, the Prime Minister stated, "I welcome the decision to keep our borders strong and keep Australians safe."
I don't think it's fair that he'd be allowed to come in, to be honest. So I think it's the right decision.
The world number one has been booted out of Australia.
The controversy riled up a global audience, including his fans and anti-vax proponents for whom Djokovic is a hero.
He was sending out a wide array of messages to the anti-vax people by his mere refusal to say anything.
Yeah, over here, looking over here.
Others saw Djokovic using his lofty status as a sports celebrity to undercut life-saving public health policies while skirting the rules himself.
He's a role model. Not only does he end up on the losing end of the draw at the Australian Open, but I don't think he does anything for his public image moving forward either.
Djokovic was the number one seed for the Australian Open. His departure a big loss. New names will be favored now from Russia and Germany, and 2 Canadians are also highly ranked contenders. Rafael Nadal wants to focus on tennis, not Djokovic.
Australian Open will be a great Australian Open, with or without him.
The tournament is underway this evening, but for the world number one, it was, as they say, an early exit from the Australian Open. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Getting a COVID-19 PCR test in Canada can be challenging, even when you have symptoms, fueling the debate over its value for asymptomatic travelers returning to the country. The on-arrival PCR test requirement was put in place by the federal government in hopes of slowing the spread of the Omicron variant. But now that it's ripping through Canada, calls are growing louder to scrap the policy as tests overwhelm the system. Abigail Bimman reports.
We're stuck.
Stuck in quarantine, waiting for arrival test results 9 days after returning from a Christmas trip to see grandparents.
What are we spending the money on? What are we expending the resources on?
It's a question more and more people are asking, with testing capacity stretched and some symptomatic people unable to get a PCR test, while returning travelers already have a negative one taken within 72 hours of arrival. Except for a small spike at Christmas, traveler test positivity rates hover around 1% and often less, while community positivity rates are now at 28%.
It's much better to direct those PCR testing and the things available at airports to population testing. We're kind of flying blind to try to keep flyers to get them tested.
Tracking every case isn't really necessary for a surveillance perspective.
Canada's top doctor says testing a sample of returning travelers may be a better way to go.
It is a capacity drain on the systems as a whole.
While the health minister refuted that in an interview on the West Block.
Those resources that we're using at the borders to protect Canadians and to protect people traveling through the borders, those resources are different from the resources that provinces and territories have access to. They use their own resources, we use our own resources.
The president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce isn't buying that, given the overall backlog at labs.
When all that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to be seen to be doing something has been focusing on the border instead of saying rationally, how should we be using our resources?
The Chamber of Commerce is part of the Canadian Travel and Tourism Roundtable, which this week called for an end to on-arrival PCR tests. Dr. Tam didn't go so far as to recommend that, but said she would advise against using resources to sequence every traveler test, given Omicron is so prevalent everywhere. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
After a punishing fourth wave fueled by the Delta variant, Alberta and Saskatchewan are now grappling with the effects of Omicron. In both provinces, hospital beds are filling up as both governments continue to resist hardline restrictions. Heather Yourex-West looks at what the strategy could mean as the fifth wave builds.
Throughout the Omicron-fueled fifth wave, Saskatchewan has been an outlier. There were no gathering limits over Christmas, and when the break ended, students returned to school in person as scheduled. But even as hospital numbers in the province begin to once again rise, the Premier is steadfast with his approach.
As we look at public health restrictions that would be put in place that ultimately would limit people from coming together, whether that be in schools, whether that be in workplaces in our community, it doesn't seem to be slowing the spread of Omicron in other areas of Canada.
Gathering restrictions, the Premier argued Wednesday, don't seem to work.
I actually don't know what empirical data that he has to back up that claim.
But this epidemiologist worries Saskatchewan is once again heading for trouble. While the number of patients in intensive care units have fallen in recent weeks, non-ICU patient numbers are on the rise.
So we are about halfway through into this wave. We are seeing 125 hospital beds occupied, and I think it could easily be doubling and tripling, from that point on.
The virus spreading so quickly, the Premier himself announced Thursday he tested positive as well.
This is the highest number of active cases that we have identified in Alberta at any time during COVID.
With more than 60,000 active cases, Alberta is also now seeing hospital numbers rise. But with PCR tests now unavailable to most people with symptoms and rapid tests impossible to find, the actual case count in the province is likely much higher, with more still to come.
We're not even seeing the cases that were caused by the gatherings at Christmas or New Year's yet. So the odds are things are going to get significantly worse.
But like Scott Moe, Jason Kenney is resisting calls to implement new restrictions, hoping instead that the Omicron wave will peak and fade away before hospitals become overwhelmed. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
An update tonight on the investigation into the deadly explosion at an industrial business in Ottawa. Officials say the remains of 4 people killed in the blast have been found but not yet recovered. So far, the investigation has been difficult.
The cold, the site conditions, the size of the area, and the magnitude of the blast have created challenges that we are continuing to deal with and overcome.
Investigators now face an additional challenge, a snowstorm expected to hit the Ottawa area tonight. The 5 people missing and presumed dead will not officially be identified until remains are recovered. The federal government is urging Canadians to avoid non-essential travel to Ukraine. Late Saturday, Canada updated its advisory, citing ongoing Russian aggression and military buildup in and around the country. Western governments have strongly condemned Russia's buildup of soldiers and weaponry along its border with Ukraine. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly was headed to Kyiv today to meet with Ukrainian officials and show Canada's support. New details are emerging about yesterday's hostage-taking at a Texas synagogue. Authorities have identified the suspect as a 44-year-old British national. He was killed after the standoff that lasted more than 10 hours. The 4 people taken hostage were safely rescued. Jennifer Johnson reports on the investigation and what's known about the motive.
The rabbi at the congregation Beth Israel was conducting a Saturday morning service when the suspect stormed in. Some congregants listened to the hostage-taking unfold from home on a Facebook live stream. The suspect was heard demanding the release of Pakistani neuroscientist Afia Siddiqui, convicted of trying to kill 2 U.S. Army officers in Afghanistan in 2008.
I do not have any information right now that indicates that this is part of any kind of ongoing threat. We obviously are investigating. Our investigation will have global reach.
Local police learned about the hostage situation after the rabbi called another rabbi in New York. Negotiations went on for hours. One hostage was eventually released. Later, the FBI breached the building, rescuing the others and killing the suspect. He has been identified as 44-year-old British national Malik Faisal Akram.
This is something that you don't ever expect to have in your own city. The rabbi is a personal friend of mine.
During the terrifying ordeal, members of the local Muslim community came to show their support to the congregation.
To say our Jewish brother that we are behind them and we full support them and against this, condemn this act.
President Joe Biden called this an act of terror.
I wanted to make sure we got the word out to synagogues and places of worship that we're not going to tolerate this.
While the captor first described Siddiqui as his Muslim sister, they were not related. Siddiqui, educated in the U.S., is serving an 86-year prison term at a federal detention center in Fort Worth. Her arrest and conviction is widely criticized in Pakistan, where she is seen as being wrongfully imprisoned. The FBI says it is already in contact with agents in London and Tel Aviv to make sure the suspect was not working with anyone overseas. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
There are reports of significant damage in Tonga after an underwater volcano erupted, triggering tsunami warnings. New video shows beachside towns in Tonga battered moments after the blast. At this stage, there are no reports of deaths, though telephone and internet connections are cut off. Australia and New Zealand say they're standing by to send help.
The tsunami has had a significant impact. Shops along the coast have been damaged and a significant cleanup will be needed.
And the eruption sent shockwaves across the Pacific Ocean, flooding coastal cities as far away as Peru. Coming up, what a nearly 2-year school closure could mean for the future of one nation's students. Students in 4 provinces are set to return to in-person learning tomorrow after the latest pandemic wave forced an extended holiday break. But imagine children and teachers in Uganda who only returned to the classroom last week, the first time since March 2020. The United Nations says it's the world's longest shutdown. And as Redmond Shannon reports, many students will never return.
A brand new school term in Uganda, eagerly awaited by students, teachers and parents like Patrick Samanda.
Of course, it's difficult for a parent to be tutoring their own child, then you go to work, and then when you leave them assignments, they don't get to do anything at all.
For almost 2 years since the start of the pandemic, Ugandan schools have been fully or partially shut. The government wanted to keep them closed until COVID-19 vaccination rates increased. A quarter of Ugandans have now had a vaccine. Only 3% are double jabbed, but authorities decided enough is enough.
So it's been really, really hard. Even when we try to do private tutoring for these kids, we didn't know for which classes are we tutoring them for. So it's been very complicated, it's been very hard.
Only a small minority of Ugandans have the technology to learn online. The government estimates a third of students will never return. Students like Sarah, only 16 and already a mother herself. She says had she been busy with school, she probably wouldn't have ended up in a relationship with an older man where she got pregnant.
This one is my name.
An old blackboard on a building that was once a school, but no more.
This was a classroom, but it ended up into a rental house.
Teachers may be lost too. About half of Ugandan schools are privately run, many of those educators forced to get work elsewhere.
I hope that this time there is no closure again. Let us manage these situations as they come from schools, and then life continues like that.
Like every country, Uganda's economy has been hit hard. Poverty has only increased. Uganda is already one of the poorest countries in the world.
I would say UNICEF would not have advised for this kind of measure. There are different measures to prevent the spread of infection through the education system.
The shock of the pandemic to Uganda's education system will have long-term effects on people's lives and on the future of a country that can least afford it. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Ahead, the life sentence seen as a victory for thousands of Syrians.
You're watching Global National.
A former Syrian colonel has begun a life sentence for crimes against humanity. Anwar R. was convicted for his role in supervising the torture, rape, and murder of detained individuals suspected of being anti-Bashar al-Assad demonstrators. As Crystal Gamansing reports, the German criminal court is the first to acknowledge the crimes committed by the regime.
His face must be obscured, but his role in the torture and murder of Syrians has now been revealed. Anwar R. was sentenced to life in prison Friday after being convicted of murder, grievous bodily harm, sexual assault, deprivation of liberty, and hostage-taking. Crimes committed when he was an intelligence officer and oversaw the interrogation unit at a notorious detention center. Court officials said the Al-Khatib prison, also known as Hell on Earth, held roughly 4,000 people when he worked there.
This trial cast a much-needed, renewed spotlight on the kinds of sickening torture, cruel, and truly inhuman treatment, including abject sexual violence, that countless Syrians were subjected to in detention facilities.
The trial, which began in 2020, included difficult and detailed testimony from victims. Before this conviction, the same court already convicted a second junior Syrian officer of accessory to crimes against humanity. Both men had come to Germany seeking asylum years ago, but were arrested in 2019.
It's a recognition of the crimes committed in Syria, and I think it's quite okay for the survivor, the Syrian who are affected with these crimes. So I hope that this sentence and this verdict will be a strong base for future work.
The German criminal court is the first to try a case against any member of the Syrian regime under the idea of universal justice. Cases like this are usually heard in the International Court in The Hague, but experts say Russia and China have blocked efforts to try cases like this there.
It is a landmark leap forward in the pursuit of truth, justice, and reparations for the serious human rights violations perpetrated in Syria.
Human rights abuses in Syria at the hands of the regime have been well documented. The civil war, which began in 2011 as a part of the Arab Spring, led to what human rights groups call the world's largest refugee crisis. Canada at the time pledged to take 25,000 refugees. Saher Shafiq, who helped during Operation Syrian Refugee, says the case serves as a reminder.
You know, it is great news, of course. It's an opportunity for justice. It's an opportunity to start some healing, potentially. But for me personally, it was just a reminder of the fact that we let these crimes against humanity happen in the first place as an international community.
For those who lost loved ones, they want the world to remember their faces, but also know that lives are still being lost. The war is not over yet. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Big baby boom. Next, the rebound of whales off Canada's west coast. When we look after the environment, nature often rewards us. And that appears to be the case off Canada's west coast, where a whale baby boom is taking place. 2 whale species are making a big comeback. Catherine Urquhart shows us what's behind the rebound.
They're some of the most majestic mammals on Earth. Bigg's killer whales are also known as transient whales, and according to the Pacific Whale Watch Association, 2021 was a great year for that orca population, which had record sightings and experienced a baby boom.
I think the message is that we have a lot to be hopeful for.
Oh my goodness. Sightings of Bigg's killer whales surpassed 1,000 in 2021, and their population of less than 400 had 11 calves last year.
Oh my God.
Migrating humpback whales also saw a baby boom with the birth of 21 calves.
In 2020, we thought that was a great year with 11 calves. And so with 21, that's almost double the year before. So humpbacks are just like the bigs, experiencing a lot of population growth.
Marine mammal protections are making all the difference, says the Pacific Whale Watch Association. Humpbacks are thriving because commercial whaling was stopped. Bigg's killer whales are succeeding due to protection of their food sources, such as seals and sea lions.
But the truth is, because we do have all these protections in place and there's so much more education out there, we are seeing animals return.
Not doing so well, our southern resident killer whales, which almost exclusively eat salmon. Their population estimated at just 74. But conservationists remain hopeful that one day they too will thrive, like the humpbacks and the Bigg's killer whales. Catherine Urquhart, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight, your Canada is Blumenort, Manitoba. We would love to see your corner of the country, so please keep sending your photos to viewers at globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Donna Friesen will be back at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a good night.